That's the name of this story. Paul Stanley Cringe. And why? Can this band stop embarrassing me as a fan? Can we please get to a point where I no longer have to apologize for this band? I just think this is a conversation that shouldn't have been had. Probably should be left to the ash heap of history. There you go, Paul. You've made cringe of yourself in 2024. Nice job. The first one I'm going to call Paul Stanley Cringe. That's the name of this story. Paul Stanley Cringe. And why? Paul Stanley has a romantic view of Kiss's relationship with groupies. Can this band stop embarrassing me as a fan? Is that a thing that can happen sometime in my fucking life, please? Can we please get to a point where I no longer have to apologize for this fucking band? I mean, my God, there was nothing tawdry about it. The whole concept of groupies is tawdry. It was companionship and they loved music. Oh, come on. Okay, before we even get into this is not going to be a conversation about whether or not I think Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, the guys from Kiss or whatever. Like, let's just put it right out in the open, right off the bat. The whole idea of groupies taking advantage of women, whether or not you know their age, their actual age, whether or not they're underage or not, the power dynamic that goes into being a rock star versus someone who wants to just meet you. You can make the argument that any rock star or any performer who has sex with a fan, it's questionable, okay? You can't... I understand that was the point of getting into a band. I certainly thought it was when I got into music. You want to play music. You don't want to have a real job. You have a burning creativity inside of you, and you want to get laid. I mean, those were like the 4 reasons why you get into music, right? But with that being said, we've all heard more than enough stories. We've heard more than enough of these songs from hair metal bands, 70s rock bands, 80s rock bands, even some 90s rock bands, which were usually way more serious. But like, we've heard enough songs, lyrical content, and stories to know that there was a lot of tawdry behavior going on. There was a lot of things that were questionable about these hookups that were going on. A lot of advantage was taken during the time. I'm not accusing Paul Stanley of doing that. And that's the point of this disclaimer, is that I'm not accusing any rock star in particular, specifically, of doing that. That is just what happened. And I'm sure it happened more often than not. I can't for the life of me imagine that there are a lot of women out there that want to be one of 5 women that you had sex with last night. I've known enough women in my life to know that that's not a thing that happens usually. There are those women out there. I'm not trying to say that that the women that they were with weren't there of their own volition. But one can argue that it happened more often than not. Not more often than not, at least 50% of the time, at least half the time, those women were like, oh my God, I'm so glad to meet you. I'm so glad to meet you. What are you doing with my head? What are you doing with my head? Like, I'm sure those things happened. A lot. And were not reported. A lot. As a matter of fact, never. It was such a brazen act a lot of times that Steven Tyler of Aerosmith wrote about it in his own book and how he adopted an underage girl so he could take her on tour with her and do all manner of unquestionable things. So let's not pretend that these types of things didn't happen. With that being said, this article might be amongst one of the most cringe things I've ever fucking read ever, and I cannot believe that Paul Stanley's out there talking about this. I don't know what would possess him to do that now. I have my theories that the political and cultural climate in this country right now is reaching a very questionable point, and maybe that's why he's come out and said this in a just grab, a desperate grab for relevancy. I mean, you've been out of the headlines for almost a year now. Gene has gone and said and put his foot in his mouth on multiple occasions. So Paul decided he was going to get in on this, I guess. I don't fucking know. Let's read the article. But first things first, let me just take a moment out here to please remind you to like and subscribe. Please subscribe to the channel and please like the video. It pushes us into the algorithm and it gets us going forward motion. I'm on the forward motion thing. It's on its way. We're picking up subscribers here and there, but I really want to set a goal. I just want to set a goal to get to, I don't know, let's say 10,000. I want to get to 10,000 subscribers by this time next year. So like a full year. Halloween 2025. I'm not asking for much. It's 10,000 people. So share this with your friends, will you? All right, back to the album. In a recent episode of Steve-O's Wild Ride podcast, Kiss's frontman Paul Stanley offered a candid look into the band's history of relationships with groupies. Surprisingly, Stanley described these interactions as quote-unquote wholesome and much more than just fleeting encounters. He reflected on how these connections were marked by a genuine love of music and camaraderie that transcended typical expectations. Says the man in this situation. That's incredible. Addressing Kiss's well-known reputation for backstage antics, Stanley clarified via Metal Hammer, "I don't think we promoted ourselves for what was going on backstage or at our hotels." Oh, for fuck's sake. It just was common knowledge. People were just seeing what was going on. He added with a smile, "It was terrific. What a great, great life. It's everything that people imagine it to be and more." Of course. If I had the ability to just throw my cock out there in a room and be like, "Line them up, bitches." And one by one, they come in and do whatever you ask them to do. I'm sure that that's a great life, Paul. I'm sure that's the best life. Oh, wonderful. I'm sure your wife loves to hear this too. It's shocking to me that this is the type of quote that would come out of this. It's amazing to me. God, talk about the things you saw. Think about the venues you played, the fans that you met. Why is this a topic? And secondly, I don't think we promoted ourselves for what was going on backstage at our hotel or at our hotels. Really? Have you heard any Gene Simmons quotes from way back when? I mean, there's a whole home video called Kiss Exposed where Gene Simmons sits on a throne with a girl dressed up in a baby doll dress on his lap. And behind him are heads of girls. And at one point, he asks them to switch, and then they move. Now, granted, that's a funny-ass bit, okay? I actually found that bit amusing at the time. However, to say that you weren't promoting the I fuck bitches narrative, that's just a fucking lie. That's just a lie. For Stanley, these experiences often included more than just wild nights, describing them as much deeper connections. The interesting thing was, for all the girls, groupies, young women, whatever they were, it was really kind of, no pun intended, wholesome. Paul Stanley and his little wordplay. They were there because they loved music. And they would travel with you. They would do your laundry. You'd go to the movies with them. There was nothing tawdry about it. It was companionship, and they loved music, and I loved them. So it was a good trade-off. I see. So they were your slaves. Did you ever offer to pay any of these people? No. Because why? Because they were trading sex with you. They were having sex with you. And you wouldn't nail it down and say this is a relationship. And it wasn't dating, because out of all the things that you said here, you could have said, I dated girls in all these cities. I went on dates with this girl. I went on dates. That would have been such a better thing to say than for all the girls, groupies, young women, whatever they were. What? Why couldn't you just be like, I went on dates. I dated a lot. And in each city, I had girlfriends. Like, it's just so dismissive. It's so weird. And maybe I'm making too much of this, and I'm sure I am, and I'm sure people in the comments will tell me I am. But it's whatever. When the podcast host Steve-O playfully asks who takes the cake for the most groupies, Stanley or Kiss bassist Gene Simmons, Stanley answered with a grin. It depends on what you consider cake, leaving the rest to listeners' imaginations. Yick. Hardcore cringe. Steve-O also touched on the honesty in these casual encounters, suggesting that a one-night stand could sometimes be more forthright than a commitment without real intent. Stanley agreed, noting that different circumstances call for different behavior. Right. That's true. A one-night stand can happen, right? I've had a few in my life. I'm not ashamed to talk about that. But I will say that almost 100% of the time, even when I was in a band and we were touring, or when I was a DJ and girls were just literally throwing themselves at me, because that's what happens when you're a DJ, I was always personally looking for someone I could connect with, and not with my member. Connect with my brain and have a conversation with. I can probably count on one hand out of the, I'm not bragging, I'm not going to get into it, but out of the many sexual encounters I've had, I could probably count on one hand how many were strict one night stands that I was looking just to get my rocks off. Okay. It didn't happen often. It really didn't, because it's not the person I am. Now everybody's different. I'm not shunning people who want to go out and have one night stands. That's fine. But this is like kind of the glorification of abusing a power dynamic. This is not your typical, I went out to a bar, I had some drinks, I met a woman, I bought her some drinks, we got funky, we had a good time, never heard from her again, or I never called her again. This is different than that. This is significantly different than that, because Paul Stanley could go into a room back in the heyday and not say more than 2 words and get what he wanted. That is a power dynamic situation, okay? I would venture to guess that even insanely hot guys who are built and fashionable and the whole nine, like they have everything going for them, couldn't pull that feat off, whereas Paul Stanley can, okay? That's where the difference is. It's a power dynamic. So I would rather have heard Paul Stanley say, yeah, I went on a lot of dates, and yes, I had sex with a lot of women, but, you know, it was a different time. And, you know, I bet a lot of those women would have preferred just to have a nice long conversation with me, but instead we did this because that's what was going on, right? I don't know. You know, it is what it is, I guess. He explained further, the women who would come to shows weren't coming there to be courted. Exactly. You have tonight, and we all know that. You know what, you know that, and I know that. And it was very simple. And nobody got hurt. Nobody ever walked away feeling disrespected or diminished. No. Nobody ever walked away feeling disrespected or diminished that you're aware of. And now, again, I want to be very clear. I feel like, you know, maybe Paul Stanley was one of the good guys. Maybe he was lucky, okay? So from his point of view, maybe he did things the right way, okay? And I'm not trying to put this all on Paul Stanley. The cringe factor and the thing that I am putting on Paul Stanley here is this conversation. It's not that it happened. We all acknowledge that it happened. This would be like, I can't think of a good analogy right now. This would be like a prison guard who treats his prisoners kindly, and he's very nice to the prisoners. But the system is still fucked, right? So the system still treats the prisoners like shit and doesn't give them adequate food, or doesn't give them adequate space or adequate medical attention, or whatever the system is that sucks. The system is horrendous. But this one guard was fine while he was doing the things that the system told him to do. That's kind of the same thing here, where Paul Stanley's talking about a system and a time and an era where these things happened. And we have all heard horror stories about women who have felt like they were taken advantage of, or didn't show up there to suck that guy's dick, but, well, it just happened and he's a rock star, so I'm just going to do it. What am I going to do? Say no? Like, we've heard these stories on multiple occasions. Not about Paul Stanley. Okay, so I want to make it very clear that I'm not shitting on Paul Stanley specifically for the actions that he may or may not have done. I'm shitting on Paul Stanley for having this conversation in such a, I don't know, nonchalant way to suggest that nobody got hurt, nobody walked away feeling disrespected or diminished. I highly doubt that. I highly doubt that. I bet if I was able to obtain a list of all the women you had sex with, I'm sure at least one of them felt disrespected or diminished in some way. I have no doubt. I have no doubt. Stanley summed up their approach as one based on transparency. We were very upfront, and they were very upfront. And they were there for a certain reason, so I don't think anybody was deceiving anybody. And that's why it was so much fun, because it was uncomplicated. You know, whatever your relationship is with anybody, hopefully it's uncomplicated, whether it's somebody you're involved with for a night or for a lifetime. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. If you're going to tell me that when they walked in, you were like, we're going to fuck now, and she was like, hell yeah, rip my clothes off, then fine, Paul, you did everything the right way. But I would hope that in the future, if you have this conversation again, maybe speak to how it's not that simple. And it's usually not that simple. It's, you know, like, what about the women that were in there shit-faced, completely drunk? I'm sure that happened many, many times. And you have gone on record as said that you have never drank. And that was Gene Simmons who said he's never drank. But still, I'm sure you weren't inebriated, right, Paul? So if you weren't drunk, but the woman was, but she's all on board, do you think maybe she woke up the next morning going, why does my ass hurt? I'm just saying. If you're telling me that the amount of women you were with was so numerous that you can't even recall who had more, you or Gene, and throughout the course of that, you want to claim that nobody got hurt, nobody felt diminished, and nobody felt disrespected? I have a hard time buying that. I have a hard time buying it. I just think this is a conversation that shouldn't have been had. Probably should be left to the ash heap of history. So, there you go, Paul. You've made cringe of yourself in 2024. Nice job.